We're gonna go for it. All right. No more headphones. Oh, that's such a delight. All right, everybody. Last talk. So, I'm Aaron Inc. This is Room Design Strategies for Procedural Metroidvania Dungeons, which sounds way more academic than I think this talk really is. I did go to grad school, so I know a little bit about, like, doing an academic style talk, but I also, like, failed out of grad school, so don't freak out. I'll try to make this full of pictures and fun. So who am I? My name is Aaron Inc. I look like that and this. I'm a software engineer and game developer and artist and musician, and I kind of do all the things. I'm also currently looking for work in the game dev space. My pronouns are they, them. I'm genderqueer and non-binary. I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Like I said, I'm a software engineer, and I'm a huge Metroidvania fan. I'm a big enough fan that I named myself after the genre, so to speak. So I care a lot about this stuff. I've thought a lot about these games. These are probably my favorite kind of games to play. And for the last too many years, probably 5 years, I've been working on and off and on a procedural Metroidvania game. And it looks kind of something like this. This is just like the random video that I had of like the most recent gameplay. This one was specifically looking at warping around between locations, but you know, it's a Metroidvania. You move around, you discover stuff on a map, fun things happen. So I had to make a portfolio, so I had these like pithy images and quotes, like classic Metroidvania action. Fill out the minimap by wandering through a world full of upgrades, enemies, secrets, and shortcuts, right? Like way too excited. The power-ups in the game are intended to be meaningful in a way that like keys generally aren't, so we're trying to open up new spaces to explore by changing the way that you move and fight. The movement upgrades synergize with one another, and they change how you can move through the same spaces. So here you're double jumping through spaces, and here you get a grappling hook, and you can go back through a little bit more easily. The dungeon generator is trying to build this big, complex, interconnected space by placing one room at a time. The rooms are hand-designed because every room is kind of like a little standalone level, similar to a game like Celeste or Super Metroid. They can have platform challenges, they can have combat, they can have puzzles, all sorts of things. And this is made in Unity, for what it's worth. And the whole thing is supposed to support a Metroidvania narrative in a way that most Metroidvania-style roguelikes tend not to. It's trying to support this narrative of like exploration first with some combat and platforming and other stuff along the way. So you're really getting lost, finding new items and beating bosses, and then getting lost again and repeating that cycle. I'm going to check and make sure things are still good with the stream. It seems like we're good. Caro is helping me out. Thank you so much for directing people to the right place. So you might be wondering, like, what actually is a procedural Metroidvania game? What makes something a procedural Metroidvania? I said that, like, this is one, but other games kind of also are ones, but aren't doing the same thing. So for me, I like to think of this, at least this is my inspiration, was Rogue Legacy plus Super Metroid. And you might be thinking, Rogue Legacy was also already like a Metroidvania-y style roguelike, and it was. It's one of my favorite games ever. I played it to death. But it was really a game about combat. It was really a game about beating up enemies, leveling up, upgrading your gear and your stats, and gradually you're exploring a world, but you already know what the world looks like. You know, you can kind of go everywhere from the start. You know that the hardest area is going to be at the bottom, and the easiest area is where you start, and the mid ones are kind of to the right and above you. You know the kind of enemies you're going to fight. Once you've played the game a couple of times, it's not really a game about figuring out where you're going. It's a game about mechanical skill. And I like that. It's just not really the game that I was excited to start working on. And for what it's worth, this was my first Unity project. It was not a good choice. Don't do this for your first Unity project. So procedural just means the content is generated by a computer. And it doesn't have to be a computer. There's other ways to procedurally generate content. Card games do this all the time by giving you a deck of random stuff to shuffle. But in this case, I mean, the computer is generating at least the world, but probably other stuff about each run of the game. The idea is that you could do a new run and it would be a new world to explore. And these runs would probably be pretty long on the roguelike scale of things, but I haven't gotten there yet. It's been 6 years and I don't know how long my runs are. Don't make this game as your first game. It should be more replayable, ideally, right? Because this big, complex space that is new every time should hopefully, you can get hopefully more mileage out of it than you could a single hand designed dungeon if you're using it the right way. Metroidvanias, obviously, like these sometimes get called search action games, which I think is pretty descriptive, right? You wander around, you find upgrades, and you beat bosses. And the world needs to be interesting. It needs to be interconnected. It has to grow with you as you get more power-ups and more interesting things. And that's a really hard thing to do procedurally. And we'll talk about why a little bit. And you might notice I have a Celeste shirt. I have too many Celeste shirts. I have replacements for my Celeste shirts because I'm obsessed with this game. I talked about the pixel art from Celeste yesterday, which I figured out how to replicate in working on this game. So if you're here from the talk yesterday, welcome. Thank you for coming back. I think it's important to think about platforming in a game like this, because when it comes down to it, you need the moment-to-moment gameplay to still be fun, right? And so in this case, I'm also thinking of this game as a platformer. Movement needs to be fun. You need to incentivize expression through the mechanics, so the upgrades and stuff that you get need to mean something, or else there's no real reason for you to be picking up. They could just be keys. And we want to reward mastery. We want like the roguelike thing of being able to perform better and getting through the game more effectively. And that could be navigation and combat as well, but primarily, the moment-to-moment movement through the space should feel like a mechanism for expression and mastery. And so when we talk about generating a Metroidvania dungeon, we have to talk about like dungeon feel, which is this term I'm making up, but I use it to refer to like the overall gestalt of the space, right? Like, what does it feel like to be in this space, to be looking at it, to be moving around inside of it? This is what Super Metroid looks like from a side view. If you could see all the mini-maps at once, they would look like this. You can't see this in game. This doesn't exist, right? But this is helpful for visualizing how big and complex the space is. If you look up the world map for Hollow Knight, it's even bigger and even more twisty and turny and even more complex, because as time has gone on, the standards for what a Metroidvania dungeon should look like have gone up, right? So it needs to be big and interconnected and complex, which I mentioned before. The overall dungeon has to be kind of shapely, which is a gross word, but you know it when you see it, right? Like, we know what a Metroidvania dungeon should look like. For what it's worth, Metroidvania is Metroid plus Castlevania. It's not so much the two of them combined, as they are both exemplars of the genre. I lean more on the Super Metroid end of the spectrum, but like, obviously Castlevania Symphony of the Night is a huge source of motivation for lots of developers. It just wasn't my preferred one of the two games. I love them both. It needs to have a map and a mini-map. I think both of those are pretty important to me. I think they both serve really important functions in navigating through a space. It should be separated into discrete areas. You can have the big world, you can have different zones, which are colored differently here, and then you have rooms, which are like little levels unto themselves. All of these different, like, clumps of content need to feel distinct while still feeling physically connected. It has to feel like a world. The world is a huge character in these games. So we want to gate exploration through this world on some power-ups. This is part of the Metroidvania formula, right? You need to find the secret hidden thing to upgrade your own ability to move through the space or fight enemies such that you can get to the next thing. And this is really important, because if we don't gate exploration, it's super easy to get lost in these games. And this is a big problem with a lot of these games. Hollow Knight has a huge problem with this. Super Metroid had a big problem with this. These spaces are labyrinths, or they can be, depending on how they're designed. So gated exploration is a mechanism to sort of partition this space into bite-sized chunks, where if you can't explore too much of the space at once, it's harder to get lost. And the power-ups are the things that expand the playable area, and they should make the game more fun. They should give you more options. They should let you do more interesting things. The exploration should be non-linear, so it shouldn't just feel like a hallway that you're walking down. There needs to be optional content. There needs to be branches and secrets and challenges and stuff that you don't need to get, but that might make you feel stronger. And that power curve is another big part of the overall feeling. And the dungeon needs to be completable. You need to be able to get everywhere. And this actually is one of the hardest parts of generating these kinds of dungeons. So how do we generate these dungeons? Well, we build a thing called a dungeon generator, or that's what I'm calling it. Different people have different words for these things. this is a visualization of my dungeon generator building out a dungeon with 3 distinct zones. So this is like the mini-map representation of that, right? And really all this does is it places rooms one after the other to build this big connected space. And its responsibilities are pretty specific. It's responsible for a lot of stuff, but we can break it into different categories, right? So it's responsible for the size and the shape of the overall dungeon. It's responsible for the balance of the dungeon, so not just how hard is it as you move through it, but also how much platforming versus combat versus exploration are you doing? How much time are you spending doing different things? How big are the relative, scopes of the different zones? And like, should they all be the same size? Should they be different sizes? What is the pacing going to be like, right? And pacing, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Pacing is like, how long does it take you to get from thing to thing? How long do you spend lost? Really important things that it's easy to overlook in a generator like this. And it has to support the narrative, right? It has to make you go through the process or make you go through the steps that the game designer intended you to have when you're exploring this new space. And if the dungeon doesn't support the overall narrative of the game about searching and finding and getting lost and beating bosses, you're not going to have a fun game. And there have been attempts at making Metroidvania generators that just didn't work on a fundamental level because this narrative wasn't well supported by the actual gameplay and by the dungeon itself. And really, these generators are only as good as the rooms that they have to work with, right? You can't make a good dungeon out of bad rooms. You can, but you can't have the rooms be the stars of your gameplay anymore. There are examples of games that have kind of really limited rooms, but are very, very fun to play. Enter the Gungeon, for example, has really amazing gameplay, amazing gunplay, really well-designed enemy encounters and combat, really cool bosses, great music, great visuals. Its rooms are a little boring because they're kind of hand-designed templates that get stamped into place and they're connected by hallways. But it doesn't need them to be incredible because that's not the point of the game. The point of the game is shooting monsters and getting cool guns, right? And seeing how the cool guns combine with all the other items to make you really strong. And the look and feel of the dungeon is really sort of controlled by these individual rooms. Because the player might see parts of the minimap, and maybe you'll show them a world map, but most of the time they're looking at the rooms, right? So if the rooms don't feel like a Metroidvania kind of space, the game's not really going to work. So this talk, after all of that, is really talking about room design and not overall dungeon generation. I might do another talk later about how the generator actually works, but we're going to talk about how we build these rooms. So, this slide is weird. I'm just going to reveal all the content in it so we can talk about it. So it has rooms have some content in them. They have terrain, maybe they have enemies, maybe they have puzzle components. They have stuff that the player can interact with. They occupy subunits in the map because the map is a 2-dimensional grid. That's not true of all Metroidvanias. It's not true of all roguelikes, but it's pretty common to have a map that's made up of a 2D grid of these rectilinear rooms. They have openings that let us connect to other rooms. So I might be in another room to the left of this one, and there might be another room off to the right. And if we make these rooms as templates, we can copy and paste them to build out our dungeon if we make enough of them. You can generate rooms like this. There are games that have done it successfully. In my case, I wanted a hand-designed feel to these rooms. I wanted them to feel like individual levels. I wanted them to have kind of satisfying platforming stuff going on. It's very hard to generate that stuff out of, from whole cloth. It's much easier to make sure that every level feels good if you have hand-designed control over all of the levels. And so you might be wondering, what makes a good room? We can make lots of rooms, but how do we make sure those rooms are fun? And I think there are different metrics to think about for the player and the generator and the designer, because they all want slightly different things. So for the player, it should be fun. It should have a strong internal narrative that teaches you how you're supposed to move through it, what you're supposed to do in this space, right? It should feel intentional. It should feel like everything that was in the room, everything that's visible and accessible to you is supposed to be there. And rooms are situational. You don't want all of your rooms to be exactly the same thing. And this ties into pacing. And generally, it just, you need to have these spaces feel like they fit for the purpose that they're being used for in context. And that's tricky when you're picking rooms out of a hat and throwing them onto a map. And there are some other like interesting situational things. Should they be challenging? Should they be atmospheric? Should they be memorable, as some rooms are more than others? And the generator doesn't care about any of those things. The generator wants rooms to be flexible so that it doesn't run out of rooms, so it can use them in all sorts of different places. It wants the rooms to generate more new interesting options that it can build more dungeon out of. And really, it wants it to generate more options without closing off options, right? You don't want to run out of potential rooms and then fail generation. And for the designer, who in this case, it's just me doing all this stuff, it gets really lonely making a big, ridiculously complicated game by yourself. I want the rooms to be expressive. I want it to be fun to design interesting stuff in them. I want to be able to mess with the geometry as much as I want. I want to be able to put interesting content in them. I want to make good rooms and good levels. I'm not good at making good levels, but having the rooms have the capacity for it at least allows me that flexibility to get better at it over time. And I want them to be easy to design and build and test and iterate on. I want to be able to make something really fast, shove it in the generator, and actually play through it, right? And so I'm going to talk about room strategies, room design strategies today for that hold up different, like that help those different metrics for the different kinds of systems that are relying on these rooms to be good, right? So let's talk about room strategies. And here's my first general strategy. It's hiding the seams. Seams remind your players that the world was not designed by hand. And sometimes they're very literal. Sometimes they're more kind of like theoretical seams. But in this case, these rooms have a big seam between them, right? Like you can see the point where the tiles of the two rooms kind of collide and it no longer looks like one connected space. But if all we do is we modify the tiles such that the ones on the edges of the room don't have a border pointing at the edge of the room, now these two spaces blend together and feel like one contiguous space, right? And that makes a huge difference on how they feel. The next strategy would be to just start somewhere. You have to start building rooms and making bad rooms before you can make good ones. We started out, I started this project with my roommate Andrew, who is an incredible game designer and engineer and a really nice friend. And he walked me through getting used to Unity and figuring out how to implement some of this stuff. And like the early prototypes were a collaboration between the two of us. And they were horrible and ugly and no fun, right? So we were just generating rectangles in a contiguous line and like numbering them. And this was never going to be a fun game, but it was something to start with. I then started playing with hand-designed room templates, but I didn't have any way to actually build rooms. So I just took screenshots of games that I liked, like Rogue Legacy and Super Metroid, and just mashed them up into these weird like amalgam chimera dungeons. And funny enough, I sent a screenshot of these terrible dungeons to the folks at Cellar Door Games, like a year or two after I started working on this project, and they responded. And they were like, hey, ask us, I was like, hey, can you help me out? I'm trying to figure out how to build these kinds of things. And they were like, yeah, ask us your questions. And I did. And they sent me like a 2-page document answering all of the things I wanted to know about how they actually made these things work. So you have to make things. You have to make bad rooms to make good rooms, but hopefully you can make better decisions earlier, right? If you start somewhere, iterate quickly, and follow, at least think about these ideas, right? You don't have to follow any of my advice. My game's not a game yet. Do whatever you're going to do to ship your game. Here's a general idea. The openings between rooms need to line up so you can move between them, right? If you have two rooms like that, where the opening of one is mismatched from the opening of another, you have a wall in your way. And there are ways to get around this, but generally speaking, the strategy would be to make sure you can just walk between those spaces. Depending on how your game is implemented, you might never actually be these rooms might not actually be rendered in the same space, but the easiest way to think about it for us is to align these rooms, or align these openings. And generally, you would do this by making the openings at a fixed position along each wall, and often like in the center, right? And you might notice something kind of funky about these rooms, and is that they feel weird. They feel like really gridified, because it's strange to have openings in the center of a wall, and especially in the center of the ceiling. It's really weird to like go up from the bottom of a room and then go up through the ceiling without moving through the space, especially if it's in widescreen format. It's just a little weird. And this works, but it's just funky, right? I'm doing a bad job of mousing through my slides today. It's been a long weekend. And, here's a double jump item room, right? So the idea is that you jump down into this room, you get the item, and you can't get out without having picked up the item. Classic Super Metroid like item room design. You have to get the item to be able to leave so that you can't accidentally miss it. And it just feels kind of strange that you come in the middle, walk up some stairs, then jump down, and then jump back up, and then go back down again. Like, that's not the narrative you would usually expect in a space like this, and it's not how Super Metroid would design an item room. So what can we do differently? We could break the screen into subunits, right? So if we broke it into 8, we would have more places to put our exits, and we could have rooms align on subunits instead of like a whole camera. And for what it's worth, rooms don't need to be one camera wide. They could be more subunits. But when we make rooms into more subunits, our map is way more complicated. It becomes harder to place these rooms, right? And rooms can become misaligned. So now you need like hallways, Enter the Gungeon style, to connect these different rooms, or one-by-one connector rooms that can, join together to make hallways. And again, it just doesn't really work super well, especially once you get into the actual moment-to-moment gameplay. What should the camera do when you go into a tiny one-by-one room that can't take up the whole screen? Like, should it smoothly transition? Should it go to a free camera and let you see all the rooms that are around you? Should it block out all the other rooms? You run into a bunch of problems. Also, the minimap is ugly, right? Because we're so used to having these single screen rooms take up a single spot in the minimap that once we start to have a minimap that needs to account for, like, that's actually representing the rooms as like 8x2 spaces instead, or 4x2 spaces instead of 1x1s, the minimap doesn't look familiar, and it has a bunch of empty, wasted space in it. It just feels a little strange. So I came up with a different strategy. What is off about these rooms? I've shown this to a number of different people. I came up with this idea at like 3 in the morning thinking it would never work. But people who have done a little bit of topology work can probably tell what's happening here. I'll give you a couple more seconds to think about it. 2, 1. What's happening is that these rooms don't line up at all. I am cheating. It was like a prototype where the rooms slide into place when you walk towards the opening of the current room that you're in. So instead of actually laying out all these rooms in physical space at the same time and making sure the exits align, you just make sure rooms have exits that are in the same direction, right? So if you have up from one room, you have down from the other room in the matching subunit, and you can move through that space because you don't need all the rooms to coexist at the same time. You only need the 2 that you're moving between, right? And I thought this would drive people nuts. I thought it would be really disorienting. I thought it would be immediately obvious that there was trickery happening. And it turns out it just kind of works. And interestingly, like I've been showing you videos of gameplay of this game so far, all of those are using the same technique, right? This is kind of what it looks like zoomed out, right? Like where you go towards an exit, the new room pops into place where you're going, and the previous room that you are no longer in and that you're no longer nearby ceases to exist. It doesn't have to completely cease to exist. In Unity, you can deactivate it. You could move it somewhere else. There's lots of options. But the idea is that you really only have to worry about the ones you're nearby. This means the world positions of rooms drift slightly over time, but it's really hard to notice in play because we have a minimap, and the minimap is constantly reminding us of where we think we are relative to the rest of the dungeon, and the like rounding errors of these rooms not quite lining up don't actually make as big of an impact as I expected them to. So I've been using that strategy for a long time, and it's actually been working quite well. And free movement between the rooms makes a huge difference. It makes the game feel more platformer-y, right? Like, this is a huge thing in Celeste. Being able to dash between rooms and use your momentum from a previous room to move through the next one feels really cool. It feels like the space is much more continuous. And again, we're hiding these seams, right? These rooms don't actually need to exist in the same space at the same time if we can trick the player into feeling like they do. The maps look weird, but whatever, no big deal. Like, no one's ever going to see that map. We're only ever going to show them an abstract representation of the map. Another thing to think about is thinking about gravity. So gravity is like this invisible constraint on all of your rooms. Every platformer game, every Metroidvania game that is, a side-on platformery sort of thing has to deal with gravity somehow. You need some way to move upwards. It's not like Legend of Zelda where you can just walk to the top of the screen, right? You have to jump or climb or something. And how you actually have the player move upwards makes a huge difference on the way the game feels. How do they gain height? So they could jump on stuff, right? You could make terrain that they always have to jump up, like the stairs. You could have one-way platforms that are, you jump through them and then land on them, and you could fall back down through them again, and that lets you go both up and down. But both of these can feel really clunky. Both of them are very restrictive on the way that your rooms feel. They take up a lot of space. And so how about instead we just give the character a fun ability from the very start that makes it easier for them to move upwards? This is exactly what Celeste did, right? They gave the player the ability to climb and the ability to wall jump. And those two things allow them to have the player move through these spaces with almost the complete freedom to go upwards in tight and closed spaces. And it's more fun. You have freedom of expression. It's more fun to have an ability that lets you move through these spaces really quickly than it is to be laboriously climbing up stairs. Every opening needs to go somewhere, right? You can't really just have openings that don't do anything. The Celeste randomizer has a mode where it basically makes a linear sequence of rooms, and you are expected to kind of find the correct exit, but all the incorrect exits from rooms go nowhere. They just can't leave the screen, and it feels kind of strange. Don't get me wrong, Celeste Randomizer is really cool. You should go play it. It's a really interesting experience, but it feels weird as a dungeon, right? So if you need all of these openings to build good dungeons, you have to have some way of dealing with the ones you don't use. So you want to generate all the options, but what do you do with the options that are left behind? Do you cap them with dead-end rooms? What happens if you run out of space? Like if you have a room with an opening to the right, but you have another room to its right that doesn't have an opening back the other way, that's going to be a problem, right? And if these rooms are hand-designed, you can imagine how many different possible room designs you would need to account for all these possible permutations. And you could easily get stuck, and when your generator gets stuck, you don't get a dungeon. You have to either rewind and do a bunch of steps over again or start over from the beginning, like Nathan mentioned in his talk at the start of today. And this is a tricky problem. It's a fundamental problem with really rigid room templates. If your room templates are really fixed, you're going to have to grapple with this in some way. And my way of grappling with this was to make my room templates modular. So you make the exits, you design the rooms in such a way that chunks of them can be swapped in and out at generation time to make it easier to fit them into the dungeon. So if you need an opening, you've got an opening. If you don't need an opening, you can get rid of it and hide it, put a wall there. And this works quite well. In this case, I have barriers, this concept of barriers. And this is also a mechanism for gating based on equipment, right? Like you could put a door here and have a red key that gets you through the red door. And you could make it so that any room in the game can have a door shoved into it and you can block it with a key. I don't recommend it. They're kind of boring. You could have item-specific barriers, right? Item-specific exits. So you could have things like breakable walls, which are at least a little more fun. You could have bombs that hurt enemies and break walls. You could have platforming challenges like tall ledges or really wide gaps that you need particular platforming things to move through. And you get rid of any openings that require items that aren't in your dungeon, right? This is that rooms have to feel intentional, right? So you can't just have doors hanging around that never have a key to them unless you want your players to be really confused. I guess Dark Souls is kind of notorious for putting weird stuff in the game that makes you go, this must be something, and then it never getting explained. Or maybe it's explained by lore that I don't understand. Vadi Vidya could probably explain every blocked door. But for me, I want the world to feel like it was made for you, even though, because it was. We generated it for you on the fly for each run. This works quite well for the most part. But what happens when if we can remove any opening, what's going to happen when we remove openings that are really important for the core narrative of the room, right? So in this case, if we block off that left-hand door, we have this weird structure in our room. There's nothing down there. And I've tried different things to try to make these work. I've tried putting chests in there. I've tried having the room close off and having it be a combat arena, which is what a lot of games do to make these individual rooms kind of feel like better spaces. But I don't think those work super well. I have no problem with combat arenas. If this game ever ships, it will absolutely have combat arenas in it. but I don't want them to be my only solution. So instead, it's useful to think about rooms as having some fixed narrative of how the player is going to move through them, and then having mandatory openings that support that narrative, that always must be there. And then the other openings are optional. They can be configured. Openings are mandatory if they can't be walls, which means they always must be there. The dungeon can't make a dungeon, or the dungeon can't place a room if you can't have that opening, the mandatory opening, open into a different room. But these mandatory exits just kind of help make sure the narrative of the room stays intact. And you can intentionally create mandatory exits to define the overall purpose and structure of the space. In this case, there's 2 on either side. This is a room that was meant to be moved through horizontally. And then you can have branches that go up or down, right? And this creates a lot of flexibility in your rooms. It's tricky to design them with these optional exits, but as long as you have some mandatory things, it becomes much, much easier to think about making these rooms modular in a way that feels genuine instead of just feeling like a bunch of randomized stuff. And, you know, like I said, it has some of the same challenges, but it's much more approachable and like manageable, at least in my head. Here's some more examples of mandatory exits and modulating rooms that have those exits. So this room is about going either from the bottom to the top or the top to the bottom. Both of those work, and then you have branches off to either side. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that the critical path for the game is top to bottom right, but that path always has to exist. And so it could be that one of them's a dead end that gives you some treasure or something. But, you know, you have to think about how these rooms are actually going to be placed by the generator. That's the thing for another talk. Here's another example of a really long room with even more mandatory exits. So like almost every possible position is used up by an opening here. I think this is a 3x1 room or something like that. But you can see how much flexibility it gives you, especially with these long horizontal rooms. It can be really, really helpful for your overall generation to have the ability to go up or down from them. So now let's think about blocking the path forward. How do we do that thing where the dungeon says, aha, you can't go here yet, you haven't found the double jump boots or whatever. We mentioned that we can have these barriers that we configure, and you know, we could have every barrier be configurable for every item, but it gets a little tricky, right? So if we choose an opening on the path to a new area and we set it to a matching barrier, then we could, in theory, block movement between any part of the dungeon to any other part if every opening was configurable to every item in the game. And this was my original solution. Like, oh yeah, I'll just make barriers for every possible kind of item that I can slot into every place. But that doesn't actually work super well, because every room trying to be an everything room sucks. Rooms are not fun when you do that. So this is an example, like a really bad example that I made to kind of show, okay, like if every room could be double jump blocked and key blocked, like this isn't that many items, or I think I have like a morph item that makes it really small. Just with those, you can see how many different permutations you need to have to make these rooms work for all these items. But, like, the room stops having any character. There's no room to make stuff. There's no room for platforming challenges. There's no room for interesting things. And that's a huge problem. Your rooms just don't do anything interesting anymore. And it's not just, like, not fun for the player. It's also not fun for the designer. Sorry, I am having a really hard time, like, keeping up with my own notes from these slides. I was going to prep more for this talk, but everybody else's talks were so good that I got distracted and had to sit through them all. So forgive me if I'm a little scatterbrained. This is a problem both for the player, because the room's not fun, and for the designer, because these rooms aren't fun to make. They're too flexible. There are too many things to think about, and it's just overwhelming to have to maintain all of these options at the same time. And it discourages you from adding more exits, right? If every exit you add has to be this super powered exit that can do everything, you're just going to not do them. Designers are going to do, or are not going to engage quite as deeply with the full scope of options for a room. And that means the generator has fewer options, which means it's more likely to fail. And it means you're going to spend more time making fewer rooms and making each of those rooms worse. This was absolutely my first thought, and I thought this was going to work, and I spent months trying to make this system work, and it was not a good idea. And instead, why don't we do the same thing that Metroidvania games actually do? Let's create sets of specialized rooms for the items that we're creating. So if we're making a double jump, let's make some rooms that are intended to be used with the double jump ability. And this means that instead of having to update every room in the game every time you add a new item, when you make a new item, you make rooms associated with that item, and then those can be used wherever you need them, right? And there's different types of rooms we could specialize into. We'll go into those for a bit, but the generator becomes responsible for figuring out when you need a particular specialized kind of room and selecting from that pool instead of the overall general pool of rooms. So for double jump, right? We can have item rooms that are specific to the double jump item. This is the one we saw before, where you have to jump down and then jump your way back out. By the way, this is the updated version that has the exit actually in the top right, so it feels a lot less weird. There's no stairs to go up at the beginning. We can have gate rooms that block your access if you don't have the associated item. You can make lots of these, and you could make them more memorable, right? These could help you remember where you're supposed to be in the dungeon once you get that next new item. You can say, oh, I need some way to get up there. I have to keep that in mind for later, right? And then you can have challenge rooms, which may or may not block traversal through the whole room without them, but you need the item to be able to, you need to make sure the player will definitely have the item before you start using this room in a part of the dungeon they can access, because the room is designed only to be playable, or at least it must be playable with at least that item. And remember what I said about like movement abilities synergizing with each other. You can have double jump, or you could have double jump and the grappling hook and use both of them to get through it, but you would never see this room if you only had a grappling hook, because you can't get through it in both directions with only a grappling hook. And, you know, like I said, specializing these rooms has a lot of advantages. You can spend more time customizing fewer rooms and make these rooms better. You can have your gate rooms act as signposts. So if you compare these two, that room from Super Metroid is burned into my memory. Not just because it has a big, creepy, like, dragonfish skeleton thing, though that's certainly part of it, but also because it's so obviously just like, you are not worthy yet. You must go find the thing that will make you worthy of ascending to this high place before you were able to come in here. And for whatever reason, that worked for me. It lodged in my brain. Not everybody has the same response to room design that I do, but I think this is a thing that Super Metroid did fairly well, given that it was making the genre up as it went, right? I think that signposting rooms and like having rooms be anchors to your position in the overall map can be really helpful. And having the minimap help you with this to different degrees can also be really useful. Another thing we could think about is flipping rooms. You might think that this is trivially like an easy thing to do, right? Like, oh, I've designed my rooms to go right and left, and that's no big deal. But weird things can happen when you start to flip your rooms. In theory, you're doubling your room count, which lets you, have your generator make more interesting things. It doubles the total number. It multiplies your content, right? And theoretically, it makes your generator more capable of making more different dungeons without making more stuff. Your players won't actually like these rooms any better, because over time, players are going to be able to recognize that these rooms are the same thing. And they're not actually different. They don't really have a different narrative. It might be different to move through them from the left to the right or the right to the left, but you don't actually have a ton of control. At least I don't have control over which direction a character is moving through a room right now in my generator. They're most useful when you have very, very few rooms, but once you get a more representative base of room designs to work from, they stop being as useful, especially if you can move right and left in them. They already work for both of those. They're not actually giving you more flexibility. And you will also kind of run into problems of like, how do you flip a room? Do you flip the art assets? Do you copy and paste the room and move everything over? Do you transform it in Unity and flip it around the Z axis or the Y axis? What happens to any text that you have in the room? Like if you have a shop and you flip it, do all the text on the like if you have a shop with a door and a sign and the sign has some writing on it, flipping the whole room would look really weird because now the sign would be backwards. So, okay, now you have to flip individual elements, but when you flip them, where were they? Where are they anchored? Where should they actually end up in the new room? Are they perfectly symmetrical? Things like that. Things get complicated and weird. And, realistically, the subunits and the openings change position and, when you flip a room in generation, your subunits and your openings are going to change position, right? Like here, I have color coded them so you can see each one. But that leads to a bunch of bugs because your room is no longer always like at 0, 0. It's at these labels on the positions of these rooms are kind of weird now, right? Because this one's at -2 and this one's at -1, whereas this one's at the one over there. Sorry, I can't reach over there. Green screen. The normal room is at 0, 0, and 1, 0. So if you had things that were hard-coded to your subunit positions relative to the room, those aren't going to work super well. If you had things that assumed that the center of a room, or like the relative important part of a room, was at 0, 0, those assumptions aren't going to work anymore. So this breaks a lot more stuff than you would probably expect it to. And it can be really helpful to build some kind of debug views that let you visually identify flipped rooms while you're actually like testing them. If you don't, you'll end up with bugs where like some rooms just don't work and you don't know why. And it can be very hard to tell whether a room has been flipped if there isn't something in there that looks wrong when it's flipped. So be wary of this. There's another question of how do we differentiate these zones, right? We want all of the rooms in the game to be usable with all of our tile sets, right? We don't necessarily want to have to do the first zone is always double jump and therefore it's always a forest zone and all the double jump items are in the forest zone. We want to be able to mix and match, right? And so that means that all of our item-related rooms need to work in every zone. They need to be configurable to the different zones and different tile sets. And this lets you change the way the room feels without changing any of its mechanics. And that's really important because what actually matters here is that it feels like a new space. It doesn't actually matter whether the rooms are genuinely new or genuinely different. It might be fun if you had rooms that only ever show up in a forest area or only ever show up in a mountain area. But generally, you want rooms to be flexible enough to be able to be used in these different spaces. And swapping out tile sets is a really useful way to do that. Unity has tile maps. There's tile map support in most game engines. And being able to swap out those tiles can be a really effective way to totally like revamp the visual aesthetic of a room without changing any of its geometry or anything like that. You can place different doodads and background elements into the room. You can add environmental effects like particles, color grading, different music, different sound effects, all the things that Metroidvania games actually do, you can do fairly easily and apply them to almost any room in your set, right? And maybe you have zone-specific content. Maybe you have specific enemy types that only ever show up in particular rooms. Maybe you have rooms with unique mechanics. Maybe the ice rooms are slippery, and there's an item that lets you overcome slipperiness, and you're more likely to get an ice zone if you have that item in your rotation of things you're going to need to get on this run. And, having the flexibility of using or not using a room in a tile set is way better than having all of your tile sets have this really limited pool of things that they can choose from. You can also change the generator parameters. We didn't talk about generator parameters today, but maybe you have more long, wide rooms and fewer tall, skinny rooms in particular zones. Like Brinstar in Super Metroid is very much about like these tall, skinny rooms that you have to kind of worm your way through. And those feel very different to the rooms in the first area, Criteria. And so that's the last of the stuff that that I had prepared the last time I gave this talk. And there's been some new developments, and I wanted to really quickly point out some stuff and maybe inspire people to ask questions about it. It's just things to think about. You should build room editing tools. You should build them in a system that makes it easy for you to make new rooms, make them very quickly, get them into the game super fast. I made these in Unity. I think Unity's ability to build custom UI for doing this kind of stuff quickly and easily is super great. I don't love all of the parts of Unity, but being able to make this stuff like this in the editor, to have tile maps that are just there and they work, to have the ability to visualize things as I'm designing them and having them live update, that's great. I really don't like having to modify configuration text files to make the rooms do what I want. I want to be able to visualize it. Auto tiling. I talked about in this last talk yesterday. It's so good. If you're making a tile-based game, like pixel art or otherwise, Auto tiling will save you so much time and so much effort. It'll make your tile sets better. It'll make you have a much easier time building rooms, which will make you more excited to build them, which will make you make better rooms. Use auto tiling. If you need help with making like custom auto tiling rules for your particular tile set, people can help you with that. I can help you with that. There's YouTube tutorials for it. Do it. Get good at these. They're really valuable. Tileset rendering. So you have all these different tile sets. At least in Unity, it turns out that replacing all of the individual tile objects in a room is really expensive. So I ended up having to build other ways of visually differentiating rooms. So instead of swapping out the tiles, I learned a little bit of shader stuff and built a shader that would let me point to a different sprite atlas while using the same underlying tiles and using vertex colors of the individual tile sprites of my debug tile set to help me figure out what sprite to swap in for each position. If you want to know more about this, talk to me afterwards. I can tell you more about this. But it's useful to think about ways in which learning a little bit of stuff from another domain, like visual effects and writing shaders, can help you optimize your dungeon, which will let you make rooms that you otherwise might not be able to make because of performance constraints. So be ready to flex a little bit. You should have ways to prototype quickly, so not just your room designs, but also your movement mechanics. You need to be able to move through these rooms, shove the player in them, and do interesting things. So up top, there's like a grappling hook that, has synergy with double jumps, where when you let go of the grappling hook, you automatically activate your double jump, and it makes the grappling hook feel better. There's Celeste-style dashes and jumps going on in the top right. There's like a hook shot style grappling hook in the bottom left. There's a bungee style thing where you attach to a point and you get yanked toward it with a constant force every frame, and that lets you whip yourself around the room. But it's so valuable just to be able to have a playable space that you can modify and tweak and move the blocks around, where you can play test these different mechanics to find out how you should build your rooms. If you wait until all your rooms are built to start building your movement mechanics, you're going to have a bad time. Your rooms will be boring, and they won't benefit from most of the things that you're designing. You should think about mini-maps. Like I said, it's a Metroidvania game. It needs to have a map. You need to give your players some kind of way to navigate the space. I've tried to build mini-maps so many times. They are always slightly bad. Some of them are more bad than others. These are 3 different ones that I've played around with. The one that I have right now is most like that top one. But this turns out to be a tricky problem. It's hard to dynamically generate a nice 2-dimensional minimap, at least in Unity. The secret for me was tile maps. If you want to learn more about how I built these things with tile maps, again, hit me up later. Is that my last slide? It is my last slide. My slide software is not showing the end slide for some reason. Oof. That's annoying. Oh well. I'm going to switch back away from this Twitch stream and over to webcam. And I'll be taking questions, and then we can round out the day and go home and take a shower and whatever we need to do. Take a nap, actually, more likely, is the most important thing for us, because I'm exhausted. But let's do some questions. I'll meet you there in a sec.